Thank you.
It's great to have such a packed room for this session. And I think our location is pretty pertinent for this discussion, sitting as we are in Richmond, in one of the poorest boroughs in London, but just moments from one of the biggest financial districts. Which links quite nicely to the title of the session, which is Slums and Skyscrapes, Space, Housing and the City under Neoliberalism. And the person we have to introduce this session, I'm sure needs not much of an introduction. I'm sure you know him, but he's the author of numerous books on Marxism and neoliberalism, and the most cited academic geographer of all time is Mr. David Harvey.
The topic has come up today, and I'm often asked, what's different now from when Marx was writing? And I think there are some big differences which we should take account of. One of these is the nature of the divisions of labour in society. The kind of division of labour that existed in Marx's day is radically different from that which now exists. New functions have been introduced, new configurations have been introduced, and the site of a lot of this division of labour has also been transformed. When Marx was writing, about 5% of the world's population was urban. Now 50% of it is urban. A lot of capitalist functions are taken up with the building and management and organisation of urban life. And to some degree, I think we need to recognise that many of the struggles which are going on around the world, Gezi Park in Turkey, the Brazilian uprisings a couple of back in 2013, have more to do with discontents on the qualities of urban life than they do with the classic kinds of thinking on the left, which is it's all based on factory labour. Actually, if you look back and look at the Paris Commune, there wasn't an industrial working class that was involved in the Paris Commune. It was, in fact, an urban uprising around all sorts of issues, and I think it was emblematic that the two first things that were done by the Paris Commune, one was to put a moratorium on rental payments, which I think everybody in this room would love to see happen in London. So let's have a commune in London and suspend rental payments, and that would be great. And the other thing was, of course, suspending night work in the bakeries, which is a workplace. So it was both a workplace and a living space kind of political movement, and discontents in both combined in the Paris Commune. But increasingly what we're seeing is that aspect of it, and at the same time the locus of employment has shifted. The three biggest employers of labour in the United States in 1970 were General Motors, Ford and US Steel, and you can know what labour was involved in that. The three biggest employers of labour right now are Walmart, the holding company of McDonald's, and the holding company of Kentucky Fried Chicken. Now, we have, I think, a somewhat difficulty on the left of getting around in our head that the people who made the auto workers who made cars were somehow or other productive of value, but the person making a hamburger is not. But in fact, hamburger is making something, and it is therefore, that is where the proletariat is. It's a different place within a different division of labour, and much of it is urbanized, and the big problem arises, how do you organize all the restaurant workers, all the fast food workers, those kinds of things, and new techniques of organizing, the new techniques, configuration of political activity have to be designed. So this is in fact one of the things that would preoccupy me as to what is the definition of a working class in our time. And it's not, as some people seem to have been arguing earlier on, that's between precarious and non-precarious labour. That's not the issue. The issue is where are they located, in what spaces are they located, and what are the, if you like, the geopolitical, territorial problems of organising a workforce which is stuck in different restaurants and different places. So this is one aspect of what I would want to raise with you and talk with you about. The second aspect is that actually building cities has become a huge part of what capital accumulation is about. And the best way I can demonstrate this is to point out that the one country whose economic development has kept global capitalism afloat since 2007, 2008 has been China, which has maintained a high growth rate, 10%, and then down to 7%, but always a high growth rate compared to everybody else that was really floundering. And the Chinese lost an immense amount of jobs in 2009 because of the collapse of the US consumer market. And there are stories, and I don't know how to verify this, that the Chinese lost something like 30 million jobs in that period of 2009. But a calculation by the IMF and the ILO at the end of 2009 suggested that the net job loss in China was 3 million, which means that somehow or other the Chinese had created something like 27 million jobs in 9 months, which is an astonishing thing to have done. What were they all doing? They were building cities. They were actually engaged in infrastructure investments. They were involved in everything else. And 25% of Chinese growth since 2007, 2008 has been taken up in the housing building alone, just housing, 25% of GDP. And that 25% of GDP has meant building whole new cities. They've built dozens of new cities since 2007. Some of them have no population in them yet. And they're still waiting for the people to come. And it's interesting that this has gone on, but it's a huge labor absorption exercise. If you add to what's invested in housing, all of the other infrastructures, highways, high-speed rail, all the rest of it, you find that Chinese investment in the built environment has been, in fact, the stabilizer of the global economy. Because anybody who's producing raw materials for the China trade has done very well. Much of Latin America came out of the crash of 2007, 2008 very quickly because they reoriented to the China trade. Countries like Australia, Chile, obviously with copper, came out of it extremely well. So the stabilization of global capitalism has been actually accomplished by a massive urbanization process. And that massive urbanization process has absorbed labor and capital at a huge rate in a situation where nothing else seemed to work. And actually, if you look around us, you start to see elements of that going on in every major city. Every major city I go to has the equivalent of docklands, has the equivalent of, some massive kind of redevelopment thing. You look at the urbanization which has gone on in the Gulf states, which is absolutely absurd. And then you look at the situation and you say, what is this investment all about? Who is it for? And you find actually that increasingly what we're doing is we're actually building cities for people to invest in, not cities for people to live in. And actually there's a crisis of affordable housing at the same time as you're building upper-end condos for all the kinds of rich folk who are actually not interested in living in them, they're simply interested in parking their money in them. If you want to launder your money from one part of the world to another, then the property market is a great way to do it. And the upper classes are actually buying these things not to live in. So one of my favorite things to do in New York is to walk around and see how many of those big tall buildings have lights on after 8 o'clock at night. And the answer is they're very often dark, which means that nobody's living in the places. But this vast amount of resources has gone into city building. And at the same time, not only has it done that, it's also created immense scarcity in the property and land market. With the result that actually property and land rents are skyrocketing in almost every major city in the world, no matter whether they've been through a crisis in the housing market or not. The United States is very interesting in this way. Maybe 14 million people lost their houses in the foreclosure crisis. That was huge. It was a huge transfer of asset values. Has that actually quelled the housing market? Well, at one end of it, yes, it has. At the other end, of the rich end, it's not at all. In fact, we have huge amounts of money going into building high-end condominiums in New York City, same in San Francisco, same in all the major cities of the United States. And this has nothing whatsoever to do with providing affordable housing. This has everything to do with just creating investment opportunities for hedge funds, for rich individuals to get into, to buy houses or buy apartments and condominiums and flip them over time. I mean, so there's a vast speculative market in which land and property rents have become absolutely crucial to the well-being of the large segment of the population. I think in this regard, it's worthwhile going back and look at Piketty's stuff about distribution of wealth and ask how much of the world's distribution of wealth is actually wrapped up in real estate. And actually turns out that about 60% of that wealth is in real estate. So this is one of the big things that is going on. So that urbanization has become one of the major means to absorb surplus capital and labour, but it's urbanization of a certain sort. And that certain sort of urbanization involves something else, which you will see going on everywhere. I saw it most dramatically just recently in Istanbul, where large segments of low-income population are being cleared out entirely. People are being relocated 45 kilometers out on the periphery in order to make way for high-end development. And so what we're seeing is a process of evictions, a process of displacement, reorganization and reconstruction of urban space in such a way that it becomes almost impossible for low-income populations to live anywhere near the center of a city. So that you start to see then the long commutes, sometimes an hour, 2 hours commuting for people to come in from the way out on the periphery where they can find some sort of semblance of affordable housing. So this, if you like, revolutionary transformation of what urbanization is about has been set in train, particularly since the 1970s. And it's very, very much connected to this idea that capital is running out of investment opportunities. That the whole question of what are profitable investment opportunities for capital has been on the agenda. The profit rate has been very low in general since the 1970s onwards. Neoliberalism has not worked as a great profit generator, except in certain areas. And much of the profit has been made out of asset speculation. Much of the profit has been made out of actually creating new assets for people to invest in. And that's why the urbanization process since the 1970s has had such a dramatic impact upon the urban landscape. I travel a lot in Latin America, and I go to cities that I went to in the 1970s. They're completely unrecognizable now. They've got all the same stuff. They look exactly the same. And the other thing that's so interesting right now is everybody in the world imagines their space is different. But when you go there, it's the same goddamn shopping mall, the same high-speed, highways, and the same sort of high-end condominiums, and it looks exactly the same no matter whether you're in Sao Paulo, Santiago de Chile, Mexico City, or New York, or Istanbul, or wherever, or certainly Shanghai. So urbanization, it seems to me, is a terribly, terribly important project to look at in terms of capital accumulation, but also urbanization is the center of a lot of political discontents. If you look at, say, what happened in Brazil in 2013, raising fares, bus fares and transport fares sparked discontent, but then discontent with all of those investments going on in mega projects, which, by the way, is another aspect of urbanization. Every mayor wants to have a mega project, and they have these crazy mega projects where they spend lots of resources on doing something, which is spectacular urbanization, but has nothing whatsoever to do with the well-being of the population, and the well-being of the population in Brazil was not taken care of by building these massive stadiums for the World Cup or investing in the Olympic Games. And so we get this discontent about why aren't we investing in other things, and then discontent around the fact that actually everybody in Brazil is being sold an automobile because the Brazilian economy depends on still actually making automobiles. So they make the automobiles and then people take them out on the road and sit on a traffic jam all afternoon in Sao Paulo because there's absolutely nowhere to go without sort of driving on the pavement and doing crazy things like that. So what I wanted to do then was to emphasize that there are a lot of things in the division of labour and urbanisation now which make things look very, very different, and where workforces are mobilised in completely different ways, where new divisions of labour are being invented left and right. One of my favourite ones, which was revealed recently in the New York Times, is nails. When I went to New York, I wondered where all these stores called Nails were about. I thought there were a lot of hardware stores around. Well, no, it's people getting their nails fixed. And now this is a huge job, and there's a huge increase. And this is productive labour. And it turns out that the amount of exploitation going on in this field is absolutely horrendous. Mainly immigrant, illegal labour, which is stuff in a room of living on call 24 hours a day to work in the nail salons of the Upper East Side, sort of curing the nails of the upper level bourgeoisie. So many jobs like that are emerging in the cities, and this is the new proletariat, which it seems to me we have to be thinking about and discussing and working through. So the appeal I would want to make is that the left take much more seriously the whole kind of question of urban discontents, that it take much more seriously the whole kind of question of urban investment and accumulation of capital through urbanization, which is producing a form of urbanization which, as I say, meets the needs of investors but does not meet the needs of populations. And at the same time, we also think about the emergence of a different political landscape in which we're increasingly seeing, and I think many of the movements we've seen over the last 15 years are about urban discontents, not so much about conditions of labour in the factories, because the factories now are in China and all the rest of it. A lot of them have disappeared or been transformed through technological change in the manufacturing sector. So this is a new situation, and it's one that we have to get our heads around. The arguments which Marx and Engels make are in fact very, very relevant to this, in the sense that if you read Engels on the housing question, many of the questions about displacement are already laid out, the way in which land rent becomes significant. The only problem was that Engels kind of said, well, we'll take care of this after the revolution. He didn't actually see it as part of what the revolution would have to be about. I think we're now at the situation where we have to see this as being foundational for what a revolutionary movement has to be about, and how to organize daily life in the city. In other words, it's the politics of daily life and politics of daily urban life which are the center of a lot of political discontents, and that is what has to be mobilized in any revolutionary transformation. And I think that the revolution is going to be an urban revolution or nothing at all. Thanks.
Thank you, David. We've now got plenty of time for questions, discussion, etc. from you guys. I think I'm going to try and take contributions in rounds of 3 or 4, just so it's a bit more manageable, and then get David to come back after those. So do we have a roving mic in here? Yay. Okay, cool. Okay, there's the first hand was here.
Hi, thanks for that, David. I suppose I wanted to ask a question about this sort of political possibilities, and I just want to begin with sort of, although we have this incredible kind of wall facing us, you know, that in our recent past in modernity we have had kind of incredible asset transfers. If you think about the American Revolution, when the slaves were freed, one of the ways of looking at this, it's kind of a horrible way, but it is a truth. That was an asset transfer of America's biggest economic asset at the time, which was slaveholding. That was America's biggest economic asset at the time, and it was taken away from the capitalists that owned it. Okay, it was taken away by the industrial capitalists in the north, so it was a kind of intra-capitalist fight. But so these great asset transfers can be made. But I was just wondering, this sounds a lot like the kind of a similar proportion of sort of economics is tied up in the urban environment and is tied up in investment in real estate. And I'm wondering, what sort of vulnerabilities do you see in real estate for the capitalist classes, things that provide us with a kind of leverage? I mean, real estate is a place where capital, this kind of crazy financialization kind of comes down to earth. You know, a huge pot of wealth can move around all sorts of bank accounts, but a condominium can't so easily be moved. So I'm wondering, do you see kind of possibilities and vulnerabilities there that we can exploit? Thanks.
Is that hand?
Yeah, thanks, David. You raised an issue which is central for revolutionaries in this period about what is the working class. I took it from what you said that you wanted to differentiate yourself from those who are saying that there have been such big structural changes in the way capitalism works that it's no longer possible for us to identify the working class. But rather you were saying that there are certain specific features that we need to take account of, like urban discontents, which can help us to identify what the working class is. Now, it seems to me that it's always been the case that the working class has been stratified. And so it's always been the case that we've made, as socialists, we've made certain differentiations within the working class, but we've always regarded the working class as the universal class, the class that is the only class in society that is capable of resolving all humanity's major problems. And I take it that you agree with that. So the question I guess I'm wanting to ask you is, do you think that the changes that have taken place in capitalism over the last 100 years have led to such a great change that we need to fundamentally revise Marx's conception of the working class? Or is it rather the case that we've got Marx's conception of the working class, and if we use that in a sensible way, we can almost automatically realise who we need to organise with in particular situations?
Yeah, thanks. I just wanted to make a couple of points. One, it doesn't, I suppose it exactly follows on from the last point, but I think it's very important the distinction David made about workers in McDonald's, to see them as fundamentally different in terms of what they produce, I think is wrong, because actually they do produce commodities, they do produce goods, and therefore they are producing surplus value for capital, if you look at it like that. And I think lots of people, the kind of common view people have of Mac jobs, as they call it, is they aren't proper jobs, they aren't, they're not producing important things like motor cars, although actually food is probably, if you think about it, more important. Maybe not McDonald's food, but food sort of generally is as important. So they're producing wealth for capitalists. I think one of the problems is that when you look at companies like McDonald's, the units in which workers work are much, much smaller in general than they were in some of the big factories, certainly in terms of the car factories and so on. And that obviously presents problems for those workers in terms of how they organise, how they join unions, if they're able to join unions. So I think that's a big question when we look at the working class, but I definitely think we have to see the working class as bigger rather than smaller. We shouldn't be excluding groups like this, we should be saying they're part of a working class. They may have different ways of looking at work, they may have different attitudes to unions, they may have all sorts of other things, but actually they are part of the working class in a very broad sense. The other point I'd just like to make is the point about sort of urban discontent, because I think in a sense this has always been true. Engels actually said, as I remember, that capitalism, I'm not sure he said you have to wait till after the revolution to solve the housing crisis. He said that actually capitalism couldn't solve the housing crisis, and that was true in the 19th century. It's even more true now when you kind of look at it. But if I think about London and what people have organised round, there have been squatting campaigns at certain points, and they were very big after the Second World War. They were very big in the late 60s and 70s, and some of the best social housing people have now as a result of those kind of campaigns. There's also campaigns around transport and all sorts of different things. So I think we should see these not as wage struggles or something separate, that you fight for a higher wage, but also people do repeatedly fight for the social wage and for an improvement in their general standard of living. And in those senses, when Marx said that the worker faces the capitalist not just in the factory, but as a landlord, as a shopkeeper, as all these sorts of things, this is still the case.
Yeah, all right. I agree with that, it's very much my point that there always has been some of this, but again, if you look at the extent of urbanization today versus the extent of urbanization even 50 years ago, we're in a different, it's a qualitative shift that's gone on globally. And if you look at the pace of urbanization in countries like China, or you look what's happening in the Gulf states and so on, throughout Latin America, you see this going on globally. And I think we've not paid enough attention to the consequences and the interesting question of organization. Gramsci made a point way back in 1919 somewhere where he kind of said, it's all very well having the factory councils and the organizing people in the factory, said, and that's very good and obvious, but we need something else. We need to organize at a neighborhood level. And he said, at a neighborhood level, you put all of the working class together. And he said something very interesting. He said, actually, from the standpoint of the neighborhood, you see the interests of the whole of the working class instead of seeing a sector of the working class as is defined within a particular factory. So in a sense, I think there's a broader sense of what the working class is about and should be about, and the organizing on a neighborhood basis becomes very significant. And I would want to say that to the degree that, working organizations, and for instance the trades councils and things like that, at Oxford I remember the trades council was kind of actually much more radical than the unions, because they had the whole interest of the whole of the working class in the whole city very much in mind. And I think that's, so that form of organisation seems to me to be something which should be encouraged and worked upon. The second thing is that actually when you take something like McDonald's, there is a fast food workers movement now in the United States, which is very interesting. And they've started to actually draw upon people who have media. They now have a phone app which allows McDonald's workers in one part of the country to know when McDonald's workers in Chicago or in San Francisco are going out on strike and ceasing work. And so you're getting these sort of flash ceasing work. And one of the consequences of that is McDonald's has had to raise wages and do a few things like that. The other thing we've seen actually at the metropolitan level is that Seattle and Los Angeles have raised the minimum wage to a living wage. That instead of $7.80 an hour or whatever it is, they said in 5 years' time, everybody working in this jurisdiction is going to have to pay a minimum wage of something like $15 or $16 an hour. So this is it's a local initiative, but it's also a territorial initiative. And we don't take enough account, I think, of these territorial possibilities. And this is one of the things the left, I think, would want to encourage more work or more thinking along those lines as to how to organize territorially, as opposed to how to organize simply by traditional unions thinking about sector by sector. So I think in all of these respects there are all sorts of opportunities, which then brings me back to the question of are there some vulnerabilities for capital in what it's doing? There are some vulnerabilities, but the vulnerabilities right now are the other way around. I mean, one of the biggest asset transfers in US history has been the fact that something like 14 million households lost their houses in the last 6 or 7 years. Who took that all over? Actually, the hedge funds did. A lot of the hedge funds went in and have bought up, all of this stuff and are now renting it out. The hedge funds, New York is a very interesting place because about 60% of New York is renter. About 10% of the housing stock was taken over in 2007 by hedge funds and private equity companies, which then started to raid it. And the raiding is kind of, okay, we disinvest. That is, we actually let the boilers go bad, and then everybody moves out. Then we can actually take what was controlled housing in terms of the rent and stabilized housing, and we can put it in the market at much higher rents. I mean, this was a whole strategy of displacement. And this displacement and evictions, which is going on in urban areas right now, is a massive kind of thing. And a campaign which is an anti-eviction campaign across the nation seems to me to be absolutely called for. But there's a big problem with that. Most of the people who lost their houses in the foreclosure, if you ask them whose fault it was, they say it's their own. They actually blame themselves. That is, there's no systemic understanding of exactly what was going on that led people to be lured into this kind of subprime market stuff and then get ripped off. And this is what I call accumulation by dispossession. And there's been a lot of accumulation by dispossession going on in urban environments in recent times. And again, movements against that are partial. And yes, there's been anti-gentrification movements around for a long time. But increasingly what we're seeing is massive displacements, usually using all sorts of reasons. In Istanbul, for example, they have a law which is an anti-earthquake law, which kind of says if your house is not secure against earthquakes, then the state can require either you fix it up and make it earthquake-proof, or you get out. And of course, most people can't afford to fix it up, so whenever they want to take over a neighborhood, they just go in with the earthquake law and say, this is not viable, get out. And so they're actually dispossessing whole segments of the city to make way for high-rise condominiums or office space or anything else. So there's a tremendous amount of this going on. And then, hardly surprisingly, when something like Gezi Park occurred, the administration gets very surprised when suddenly all the populace comes out and says, we've had enough of this. We want to have a much more democratic world in which these kind of things are not going on. And I think that what we're beginning to see is the emergence of urban movements which are unstable and ephemeral. That's, again, one of the things you start to notice about them. They're unstable and they're ephemeral, but they're there. And they're very articulate in terms of what the nature of the problem is. And I think that this kind of question is then built around exactly, well, who is the working class? What are the divisions of labour which are actually existing right now? And that is, I think, you can't go back and sort of use Marx's description in Capital to look at this. You've got to look at exactly what the divisions of labour are within cities and how cities are being run. And I take the view that I would want to define an urban proletariat as everybody who contributes to the production and reproduction of urban life. And if that is there, then there's a vast amount of people who are involved in exactly that kind of process. But one other thing which I think is significant is where is the exploitation occurring? In Volume 1 of Capital, Marx is talking about the exploitation of workers in the labour process. In Volume 2, he's talking about the realisation of capital, and you see that actually the exploitation at the point of realisation is just as important. And in fact, what we've seen through this urbanisation thing is a shift very often from exploitation and production to exploitation in the moment of realisation. And this becomes politically very important, because if you say to people who don't have regular jobs and all this kind of thing, where do you feel the exploitation? Is it the landlord? Is it the housing prices? Is it what's going on in the housing market? And the answer is, oh yeah, I have a lot of trouble with that. Are you having a problem with your credit card company, charging you extra things? Do you have a problem with your telephone company and all those extra charges that end on the telephone bill? I mean, the amount of value that's being extracted at the point of realisation, as opposed from the point of production, is probably now, probably exceeding now at the point of realisation as opposed to the point of production. We have to counter that, and we therefore have to turn that into a political issue. So to me, again, it's a matter of reshaping our politics to the dynamics of what the situation is.
There's the lady right at the back.
Thank you. So speaking of alternative discourses in relation to eviction and housing, I'm an urban design student, and there is something that's been coming up and emerging recently, and it's a term of urban commons. And if I'm not mistaken, you're one of the few contemporary scholar activists who has elaborated more on urban commons. Commons have big history and the process of commoning, but only few people have related it to the urban. And so, yeah, I just wanted to ask you if you could elaborate a bit more on what kind of potential do you see in urban commons, because also recently in Europe there's been resurgence in new forms of property, especially in France and And Italy, some Marxist lawyers in Italy have created a beni comuni and so on and so on. And for example, where I live here in London recently, I've heard of a case where Community Land Trust has managed to buy a piece of property to sort of stop these spiking rents. And I think that's something that's rather new. Land trusts are coming from the US, and in Europe they're mostly being used for the more rural areas, but I'm interested in how you see the potential of it in the urban form. Thank you.
There's a guy in a red top right at the back. Sorry, red top right at the back.
Okay. Thanks, David. It's just a question kind of a little bit in two parts, really. You talked about the ephemerality, really, of the... sorry, I'll take out my chewing gum. You talked about the ephemerality of some of these movements. I presume you might have been referring to something like Occupy. And in this morning's session, you were actually talking as well about some of the obsessions with a certain kind of horizontalism in terms of organisation, which has beset some of the more localist kind of groups that you've had contact with. And I wonder whether, you know, that actually might have been behind some of what happened to things like Occupy, actually, that there was such an obsession with process, really, that the confrontation with power and the strategy in terms of the mass mobilisation and sustaining that really wasn't you know, the priority that it should have been. And I just wanted to kind of apply that as well to your concern with the housing problems, obviously, and you've talked about a few particular problems. So I just wanted to pose the question, you know, I don't know about in the US, but in Britain, isn't what we need actually united housing campaigns, maybe starting in somewhere like London, that are bringing together all kinds of groups, whether it's tenants, unions, you know, tenants' rights organisations, whether it's you know, people struggling to buy property, property owners, whether it's social housing groups, people being evicted from council housing, all those kind of things. Don't we need that kind of, you know, united front campaign essentially on something like housing to actually have the impact, because the government's very good at dividing us on these issues, really.
There's a gentleman on the left here, or your right.
Thank you. This may be it's relatively succinct, but perhaps indulgent question, because I'm an architect and teach architectural history. The question is, to plan or not to plan? Should cities be planned? I'm thinking about Baron Haussmann. In a way, he precipitated the Soviet Union. Karl Marx LA is great, but actually he displaced massive populations in, of course, a traditional, you know, Paris. And so we're at a crux of a difficulty as to how architects might behave in this situation with regard to the modern city or the postmodern city, where everything is free for all. So it's a simple question.
And a lady here in the green top.
I was just, do I need a microphone?
I think there's people all the way back there, they're saying they can't hear you. So.
I just think that you touched on using trades councils and things like that, and we have got quite well organised workforces in the capital. For example, 10 unions are getting together on the 14th of July to have a big meeting in the House of Commons. It's a commemoration of Tolpuddle martyrs, but on all of our agendas is housing. I'm in the NUT. Teachers are travelling an hour and a half each way to work, an increasingly pressurised job where pay is being linked to results, and you know, we've got, you know, it's not a permanent workforce. People can't sustain it. It's having a massive impact. So I think you'd like, you know, to say something about how we can organise.
Yeah, I mean, there are a lot of ideas now about alternative property rights structures within urban settings. The difficulty in this comes back a little bit to the question of how this gets organised. If you want to set up a community land trust, you've got to be able to get hold of the land, and the only way you can probably really get hold of the land is if the local state helps you. So, you know, it'd be nice to think that we can go commoning just on our own, but in fact, some of the big kinds of community land trusts which you can find in the world, such as the one in Montreal, depended very much upon a certain influence with the city council, so that the land was released, so that a rather large tract of land, pretty central in Montreal, was taken off the land market and became a form of housing right that had nothing to do with being able to trade property rights. I'm all in favour of exploring those kinds of possibilities, but I would also recognise that you probably need some strategic assistance to be able to make something like this happen, which is where I part company with some of the anarchists and the localists who say they want nothing whatsoever to do with the local state. Now, this can sometimes be done at the local state level, so I think that actually gaining some level of municipal power, as has happened in Seattle and has happened in Los Angeles over the minimum wage, and could possibly happen a bit in New York City over things like participatory budgeting, which is another question, and maybe getting some land released for a community land trust to be set up by the homeless organizations. Those are the sorts of initiatives that seem to me to be initiatives that we should be pursuing. If it's possible to put together a grand coalition nationally over affordable housing in general, I think that also would be a very positive thing to happen, because then it would actually manage to get some resources. But the idea that a conservative government in this country is going to support something like that, probably forget it. This is where Bloomberg, when he was mayor of New York, wouldn't talk to picture the homeless about a community land trust, whereas de Blasio is willing to talk. Whether he'll do anything depends on another matter, but nevertheless is willing to talk. And I think that that's where certain levels of integration of political effort can be made. Now, what architects can do in this situation is, I think there's a tremendous design problem here. A tremendous design problem over affordable housing, a tremendous design problem over how can you actually produce housing of a sufficient quality and quantity to address the needs of a population that is essentially spending far, far too much of its money on housing. I mean, I don't know how it is here, but in New York City, about 50% of the population is spending about 50% of its money on housing. And if you're only earning $30,000 a year, then that means you have hardly any money left over for anything else. So this is there's a big kind of question of how to produce good quality, cheap, affordable housing for populations that are massively in need. In order to do that, of course, there has to be some curbs on on all of this massive amounts of materials. I mean, the thing that impresses me when you go to some of these new developments is the qualities of the materials that are being used. I mean, you'll see marble, you'll see all kinds of things. These are incredibly expensive condominiums being built, and you're kind of running around saying, where's the golden toilet, and then you kind of think, well, maybe we should go occupy it. We had this joke with the picture of the homeless, well, which one would we go for, Well, ones with the golden toilet, we'd love that. So I think there's a lot of thinking to be done about this, and I was kind of saying to some architecture students, we should actually organize to go to the top of one of these condominiums, 50 stories high or whatever it is, and get a big banner and hang it from the roof and say, this is insane. Don't you realize this is insane? And you look at those pictures of urbanization in Dubai and places like that, and you say, this is insane in that part of the world. And the same thing you would say, in almost every city you go to. You go to Sao Paulo, you see some of these things going on, and you say, this is insane. This is an insane use of resources in a situation where the mass of the population are really having a very hard time meeting their housing needs, and you're spending massive amounts of resources using incredibly expensive materials just to produce these things, not for people to live in, that is my point, just to invest in, so that you can park your money there and then launder it if you want to in the right kind of way. So, I mean, This is, I mean, you just kind of, and then people, when you say this, and people look at me and say, you're insane. I say, I'm not insane. I've never been saner in my life. It's you who are fucking insane. And you don't understand, and people don't kind of, well, we've just got to get this. This is an insane use of resources around what urbanization is about. And if you pick up, one of the things architects do is to try and add some architectural glamour to this whole thing. So that, and that gets me pretty angry with architects. I think they should have better things to do than to sort of simply glamorize this whole kind of thing, which is actually about a big boondoggle for the upper classes to park its wealth in upper income properties of various kinds, and without actually, like again, not paying any attention to meeting the needs of the people.
Okay, we have a little flurry of hands. There's a lady here.
I was wondering if you could comment on the way cities are structured and how that would affect a revolution, like in Paris, where they cleared out all the slums, and like how these big apartments and how the way that the city is structured could help or hinder social movements.
There's a hand somewhere here.
This isn't a question, but it's just to say from the Bromley by Bow Centre in Tower Hamlets, and we have a meeting with the East London Community Land Trust on Tuesday evening, and if anyone here would be interested in coming, it's at 5 o'clock. And we also have an architect there, so talking about architects, we have an architect who's interested in trying to buy parcels of land that are not of interest to property developers because they're too awkward to develop on, get a group of 20 people together and produce very, very affordable housing for groups of people like that, and he will be there as well on Tuesday evening. So if anybody would like to come, they can talk to me later, or look up where the Bromley by Bow Centre is on our website. It's 5 o'clock on Tuesday night this week. Great.
And there's a hand just here, just behind.
Moving away from talking about housing and rent, I was wondering if you could sort of further comment on public space and particularly sort of anti-homelessness, things like the anti-homeless spikes, and how that might sort of relate to the urban discontent.
And at the back there.
I want to make two comments, one on the working class and widening the definition, and the other on land ownership. On the working class, I'd like to say that 80% of people on PAYE are on basic rate tax, so on under £40,000 a year. That's a lot of people. And when you look at the top 1%, many of those aren't paying any tax at all. And so I think that's a hugely unifying definition of who is working class. On the issue of land ownership, there's a really good book by Rod Carhill on Who Owns Britain. And basically, he analyses who owns the land, and something like 70% of the land in this country is owned by less than 1% of the population. And many of that 1% goes back to feudal times. You're talking about Plantagenet families. It's just the two comments I wanted to make.
Yeah, on that last point, De Soto has this thing about mystery of capital, who kind of says basically you can't have economic development unless you have a lot of individualized home ownership, blah, 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 and property rights and all this kind of stuff. And you have to point out to him that the Industrial Revolution occurred in a country, Britain, where about 80% of the land was owned by about 25 families, and the monarchy and the churches and the Church of England and the Oxford and Cambridge colleges, and that was about it. And it's still pretty much incredibly biased on land ownership. But land ownership is rather different from property ownership, and I think there's a big kind of question is who owns the property and who owns the land. And that separation sometimes between land and property is a very interesting dilemma. There are some American cities that have that division, it's sort of a feudal carryover. But I think, you know, the levels of, you know, in a funny sort of way, I mean, your argument is, I think that it's very easy to identify who the upper classes are. I mean, the top 1% is kind of the oligarchy is there, and you know who they are, and you know what power they wield, and so on, and you see what they do, and so you only got to look at Rupert Murdoch and a few people like that to know what this is all about. So it's in a funny kind of way, people get sort of say, well, you know, the working classes has become diffuse as a middle class, all this sort of thing. But the upper classes are very clearly defined. They're very clearly defined. The question of both public space and is urbanisation a help or a hindrance? Urbanisation has become very much coloured by questions of social control. For me, one of the most important things that happened in the United States from 1945 onwards was suburbanisation. Now, suburbanisation did two things. First, it was a massive reurbanisation project which absorbed vast amounts of capital and labour, just like the Chinese have recently been doing. And the United States came out of the slump of the 1930s, effectively through suburbanisation, building all the interstate highway system and all the rest of it. So it was partly an economic thing, but it was also a social thing. That is, individualised home ownership was offered to large segments of the working class, and they went to the suburbs. And you can't imagine a revolutionary consciousness coming out of the suburbs of the United States. And in fact, as somebody said back in the 1930s, debt-encumbered homeowners don't go on strike. So debt-encumbered homeowners become actually one of the vehicles for the stabilisation of the political support for capitalism, because you can always go to those debt-encumbered homeowners and say, look at those socialists, they're going to take your house away from you. And immediately everybody becomes anti-socialist, anti-communist, because we're going to steal their houses, which is their one form of asset wealth that maybe they can build some assets with, which is why the foreclosure movement in the United States came as such a shock to large segments of the American working class. But the point about this is to say that look at the social control or the political control that was exercised through the suburbanisation of the United States. So the suburbanisation had a dual purpose. One, get the United States out of its crisis of the 1930s. Two, stabilise the population. And what does the World Bank do now when it starts talking about housing policy worldwide? You know, homeowners stabilise the community, they say, and they are more interested in stabilising everything, and they don't rock the boat. And actually, this is also happening with student debt. There's now a good deal of information that shows that students who are heavily indebted don't go out and rock the boat. They're busy being, you know, kind of yes people to the corporates that give me my money so I can get out of debt. So by having debt encumbered, you know, populations, you actually tie people very much into the dynamics of the system. And so, yeah, there's a lot of that going on. And of course, Margaret Thatcher's whole thing about, so, you know, privatisation, social housing was very much about, you know, doing exactly the same sort of thing. So I think that there's a lot to be said about the way in which urban policies become mechanisms of social management, social control, which are generally speaking directed towards configuring things in a way that is, you know, has a particular class character, which of course then leads into the fact that, you know, people don't like to see homeless people around, so you put those spikes on chairs and things. So public space is no longer public. It's always completely controlled and becomes controlled in a certain class interest. And in fact, this distinction between public and private space starts to disappear. Most of our spaces these days are a bit like shopping malls. They're free of access, but you better behave exactly in a certain kind of way, otherwise you get kicked out or thrown in jail, or you're disturbing the peace or something of that kind. So there's less and less possibility for finding spaces of public protest. We have this situation in New York where radical organisations find they cannot afford the rents, and so some of them have actually gone under because they can't find any place to be. And to the degree that they have any place to be, it's out in, way out. And so this came about also, interestingly, in the Occupy movement, because, Occupy London thought that, whatever the square's name is, it was a public square. It wasn't. It's the City of London. And the City of London. So they had to go sit on the steps of St. Paul's, be the closest thing to a public space. In New York, it was Zuccotti Park, which is a private park, which is open, which was occupied. So that actually, even public space has disappeared, and certainly public space in which you can do anything you like and hold a political meeting have disappeared. And right now, this whole kind of business of regulation of public space is being taken up in such ways in cities that actually the whole kind of territorial organisation of the city becomes, again, an exercise in mass social control at all kinds of levels. And I think there's a certain awareness of that says we've got to actually create commons, we've got to create public spaces, we've got to create possibilities, new possibilities. And that in itself is a battle. There's a lot of public space in New York City, but most of it is closed to public activity, particularly state spaces. I mean, opening up school playgrounds so that you can actually use them for actual social purposes, forget it. You have to get permission from 15 different authorities to be able to do something like that. So this is the kind of the way in which urban life is being organised. And I don't have to tell you that actually urban life is becoming increasingly militarised, and that social control is becoming increasingly militarised. I mean, even the United States, people were shocked at what happened in Ferguson, Missouri, when a small demonstration is greeted by the local police force, which looks like it's invading Iraq, and it's got all this ex-Iraq equipment with big things, and it's going down the street. This is the way in which cities are evolving. They're becoming incredibly militarized institutions and surveyed. So all the closed circuit cameras and all that sort of thing. So we're living in a different kind of urban world, which is very much more militarized and surveyed and controlled. And again, there has to be something said and done about that in terms of political resistance to it. And of course, they can track pretty much what you're doing by, if you use a credit card, they find almost everything you've spent and where you spent it. I have a card on the metro system in New York City which records every journey I make. So if I want to have a secret affair with somebody, I don't go on the metro, I have to go, have to walk for illegal assignation, I mean, this is the kind of world you live in, because I could get you my metro card, and they send me a list of journeys I've made in the city every now and again. It's very interesting. I got on 59th Street, got off it, it's amazing. So this world is again, the whole kind of urban ambience, it seems to me, is something that is politically very tentative right now, and is full of conundrums and full of political opportunities as well as political pitfalls.
I think we've probably got time for a couple more questions, contributions from you guys. So yeah, there's a hand just by the pillar.
I hope I phrase this correctly, but London is obviously, the UK is very London-centric, and I'm interested as to how we can positively look at developing the rest of the UK so that people are able to spread out and not think that they have to come to London in order to develop their career or develop their existence in whatever way they might, so that actually we can have a more positive, decentralised UK. And what do you think on that?
A good idea.
Anyone else? Last call for hands, questions. Oh, see people here.
Thanks. I just wanted to agree with David that the local state and local democracy is really important in terms of defending public land and public housing provision. And I think, you know, that's a really important site of struggle, of community struggle for us. And that councils, in our case, in Britain, need to be given the power to build housing, to borrow, and to use the land that they've got. And although that's not perfect, because it's still the private sector that's building, because we're still living in a capitalist society, there is an element of democratic control about that. As well as that, people have talked about the squatters and the tenants in private rented housing, and I support Jeremy Corbyn's call for private tenants of private landlords to have the right to buy their home, just like tenants in social housing have. On home ownership, I think that it's true that home ownership can be an effective form of social control, but maybe only so long as interest rates stay low, and they have been historically low. And then when interest rates rise, perhaps, you know, things change. But I think part of this is about, you know, how do we identify the power to push back the corporations and the government in terms of their agenda. And I don't think it's just about, you know, either community struggles or workplace struggles. The social struggles, the struggles for tenants' rights and so on are as important as the workplace struggles. But surely one of the Achilles heels of the system, big Achilles heel of the system, is that we produce the wealth. And if people stop producing burgers and stop you know, serving in the supermarkets and driving the buses and all the other things that workers do, the system stops, and I don't think we should lose sight of that.
And the final contribution is a lady here in a green scarf.
Thank you. I just wanted to ask, how do we extend this discussion with a rising number of unemployed people and what we call today the precariat, and also this sort of intergenerational inequality as well in terms of capital redistribution. And I think it would be important not to exclude, you know, the younger generations. They should be included in the discussions of how we proceed, go forward.
Thank you. Before I ask David to come back on those final points, I just want to do a quick shout out for the final sessions. We have Lenin and the Art of Revolution with John Rees and James Meadway in this space in about 20 minutes time. And then we've got up in venue 1, Did Commodification Kill Culture, with some brilliant speakers up there, and across the hall in venue 2, we've got students fighting for a future with another excellent panel. So I hope you can all stick around for those final sessions. But finally, I'd like to pass over to David to come back on those final contributions.
Look, the dynamics of class struggle in the city are likely to be rather different from those with which we are familiar. And I think one of the things that came out of something like Gezi Park, and it's interesting, in Istanbul, in Turkey, they talk about Gezi not as an event, but as a process. They talk about the Gezi process. And the Gezi process was, I think, very significant in the way in which it started with just a mild protest against this idea of chopping down trees in Central Park and building a kind of shopping mall in its place. And people came out, and then of course they were greeted with a huge repression, but that then brought more people out. And at that point, people had to actually start to provision each other and provision themselves and support each other. And they started to have a different vision of what urban life could be about through the process of surviving what was going on around them in a very, very difficult situation. And this is one of the things we mentioned this morning about Greece. This is something that could possibly happen in Greece, that something like the Gezi process, if it can get going in the way it did in Istanbul, would be something really significant. And The Gezi process carried over, of course, to the recent elections, so that the Kurdish population now is represented in parliament, and all kinds of things have started to happen in a way which is very, very different. And that was opened up and would not have happened had it not been for these events around Gezi Park. And the thing that was interesting, and is interesting always about these struggles, is this, that this was a local struggle in Istanbul. Soon it became metropolitan-wide, so that other neighborhoods were joining in and doing their part, and it spread to all the other cities in Turkey. In other words, it's spread throughout the whole urban system. The same was true of the protest that occurred in Brazil, which started in Sao Paulo and Fortaleza, and then actually, in Salvador, and then was in about 150 different Brazilian cities and towns. So this is there's a contagion effect, and the contagion effect usually starts to get motivated around other things. But at the center of it is this idea that another kind of urban life is possible. That systems of mutual support. I mean, middle-class families were cooking food to give to the protesters in Gezi Park, and they were delivering food to people. The hotels around, when the gas came in, opened the doors and let the protesters in the hotels. I mean, and people were opening their doors to people they would never talk to. In other words, it opened up a set of possibilities in a remarkable way. And everybody who was part of that will tell you that, there's different accounts and what happened where and all this sort of thing. But the thing is, the Gezi process is something that is very, very significant in terms of a vision of an alternative urbanization, an alternative way of people organizing their social relations and organizing their provisioning and organizing themselves politically in ways that they had not done before. And this is where there is this unpredictability which attaches to the dynamics of these urban struggles, and in exactly the same way that the Paris Commune didn't come out because somebody planned it. It came about in a particularly dynamic sort of way. And as you recall, Marx himself, when he was looking at the prospect of something like the Commune, said, no, don't do it, we're not ready. Working class is not mature enough, it hasn't got, it's not ready, don't do it. So his initial statement was, don't do it. But when it started, he kind of said, okay, you started, go for it. And changed his mind, and then kind of said, but it's astonishing that this movement, and then he looked at the things they were doing and saying, well, these aren't ordinary working class people in the sense that I'm really thinking about it, but they're doing working class type things, and if they're doing working class like type things, they must be the working class. In other words, there's a redefinition of the working class, and I think that actually people will find themselves identifying with the working class in a situation of revolution and revolt, and may actually sort of do something which is radically different. So these dynamics, I think, are something that we have to be very, very aware of and be prepared for. Nobody predicted something like Gezi would ever happen in Istanbul. Nobody predicted what would happen in July of 2013 in all those Brazilian cities. But we've seen events like this before. My first experience of the United States was going to Baltimore in 1969, 1 year after something like 150 cities in the United States had a simultaneous uprising in the wake of the death of Martin Luther King. And this was a mass urban event, so it's not just simply a city, it's a whole system of cities. And I remind you that actually what happened on February the 15th, 2003, that massive demonstration in all those cities all around the world, right, simultaneously was an extraordinary event saying, do not go to war over Iraq. And that was, who planned that? Was there some sort of central committee of the revolution that planned that? No, it came about in a different kind of way. And I think we've got to get used to the idea that these things come about in a very, very different kind of way, and be prepared to ride with them rather than sort of start to pass judgment on them immediately and kind of say, well, it's not the way Lenin said it should happen, so we're not going to take any notice of that, or something of that sort. I think we've got to look at the dynamism and ride with the fluidity of it, because it's a very fluid situation. And I think as we're seeing, or we're likely to see in, I think in Greece in the next few weeks, How it works out is very, very unpredictable. But we've got to be prepared for all sorts of contingencies and all kinds of possible things to happen.
Thank you to you guys for your questions, contributions, and thank you again to David for joining us today.